A question that I was asked so many times last year after I did my video series on how to write a book series was, can you talk about the difference between a series and a serial? But the truth is, that is not the right question. The real question is, what's the difference between a novel and a serial? That's what we're going to talk about today, so stay tuned. Welcome back to Heart Breathings. So as I said in the intro, really when you think about serials, all serials to me are a series, because a serial, by my definition, is a story that unfolds over multiple volumes. So you can't just have a serial that is one single episode. You need at least 2 or 3 episodes to get a serial going. And I would say that most serials have 4 or more episodes. I wrote a serial called Sacrifice Me. It has 6 episodes inside this first season. And then I also wrote a second season of this same series that continues on and also has 6 episodes. So my serial total has 12 full episodes, and that basically would equate to 2 full novels or 2 seasons. So a serial is a series. So when we ask what is a serial versus what is a series, really what we should be asking is what is a serial versus a novel? Because as we talked about in my previous video series last year about how to plan and write a series, there are many different types of series out there. A serial is just another type of series, but a regular series, whether it be a dynamic series or a standalone series or any of those types of series that I talk about, is usually made up of novels. A serial, however, is made up of a different type of structure. When I started looking into this video and researching for it, I came to realize that there are actually a lot of differing opinions out there about what a serial actually is. And in fact, I couldn't find a single industry standard definition. And I found a lot of videos on YouTube that say things about serials that I don't necessarily agree with. So I'll just put it out there that what I'm going to say about a serial comes from my own opinion and my own experience. But there are other opinions out there. So for example, some people will just tell you that a serial is a novel broken into pieces. I personally don't fully agree with this. If you have a novel that's already written, that was written to be a novel, you can't, in my opinion, usually just divide that up into 6 pieces and throw it onto Amazon as 6 different volumes of a serial. A serial has a slightly different structure to it and different pacing than a novel. It is meant to be read in installments, in chapters, in pieces. So the structure and the way that you ramp up the conflict to make people want to read the next part is part of the structure of a serial. A novel, however, is meant to be read as a full-length novel. You're supposed to read this whole thing all at once. Whereas with a serial, while I can package it together once it's completed, this originally was published in 6 different installments and was meant to be read with that kind of fast-paced excitement where you finish one episode and you can't wait to get to the next. So I really don't feel that a serial is just a novel broken into pieces. Some people will also say that a serial is any story that doesn't stand alone and progresses over multiple volumes. Well, I also don't fully agree with that, because that would be saying that basically any series that is a dynamic series or continuing series of any kind is a serial. But I personally would not call The Wheel of Time, for example, a serial. Those are complex 300, 400,000 word books in these large tomes. I don't see that every book in that series is an episode of a serial. To me, a serial is something that is much more short-serving, much more fast-paced, and it reads more like a chapter or a section of a book rather than a full-length novel. So this is where it comes into play that we come up with a definition of a serial that is really not what's the difference between a series and a serial, but what's the difference between a series of novels like The Wheel of Time or like my Shadow Demon Saga versus a serial like Stephen King's The Green Mile. What makes that different from a series of novels? So that leads us to me trying to come up with a definition, which has been a little bit difficult. I am notoriously bad at definitions, so I'm going to take a stab at it and do my best. A serial is a complete story arc told in multiple, often fast-paced installments. That still can sound kind of like my definition of a series, but hopefully you understand from my earlier explanation how it's different. Here's another way that I can describe it without having to give you a definition, but to put it into layman's terms, so to speak. In my mind, when I think about it, a novel is like a movie. So you have the story question, almost all of your questions are answered by the end of it. You've got kind of this one driving conflict and all of this complex, like rising and falling action. You've got 3 full acts, a huge battle at the end, or, depending if it's an emotional, but basically a fight to survive at the end in one way or another, be it emotional or psychological or actual physical death. And then you have some kind of resolution to whatever that first initial story problem was. Now, with a novel or a movie series where there's going to be multiple volumes of this movie series, like a trilogy. So we're thinking of things like The Matrix. You could watch The Matrix, but of course you have questions at the end of it and you want to keep going. That story unfolds, yet each individual movie has its own complete story arc and character arc in each one. So another example of this type of series would be the Star Wars series. So you've got 9 complete movies, and yes, it progresses in terms of they share a story world, and the storyline progresses from one novel to the next, or one movie to the next, and you see the same recurring characters, and it has a thread that holds it together in this big umbrella. But each movie does stand alone with some kind of satisfactory conclusion to the main story question. There's rising, falling action. It's an entire thing in and of itself. So that's the way I think of novels. They're movies, and sometimes they're standalone movies, and sometimes they're movies that you need to see multiple movies to get the full character arc or to have all of your questions answered. But a lot of your questions are answered, and there is some kind of resolution in every single one. Whereas a serial is more like a TV show. A television show that is told in multiple installments would be something like Lost. In Lost, you watch that first episode, you don't have any resolution. There is nothing but questions after that first episode. And for some of us, there's nothing but questions after the final episode too, but you may have rising action and conflict, and maybe you have a bit of resolution to some kind of relationship thing, or you get one answer is revealed to you. But usually in a television series, especially one like Lost or Weeds or something where it's a dynamic storytelling where you have to watch them in order and there's lots of cliffhangers and twists and turns, you get more questions each episode than you do answers. And it takes you an entire season of episodes. Sometimes that can be 10, sometimes that can be 26 to get the full story of what's really happening in this season. Another example would be, since I used the Star Wars movies as movies compared to novels, look at The Mandalorian. So in The Mandalorian, you have multiple episodes before you really get resolution to the story's main event for this particular season. So in this way, it's just a different type of storytelling, where in novels or movies, you do maybe still have a few questions that linger on. You may have these overarching storylines, but you do have a self-contained complete storyline in each movie or each novel in a series. A serial, it's not as self-contained. It's usually maybe just a scene or two that may provide one answer while giving you 5 more questions. And there's always that feeling of, this is not resolved, this is not resolved. And every time you finish reading a serial, you should have that feeling of, I've got to read the next one. That's part of the point of it, is to have that anticipation, that breathless anticipation. This is part of why we watch TV shows and we enjoy those like cliffhangers and all of those things. Well, at least I do for sure, is because we want that depth of being able to watch something unfold over 13 episodes rather than just one single sit down and have to watch it all the way through. If you wanted to look at it that way, you could say that The Mandalorian is like one big movie broken into episodes, one novel or one story broken into pieces. But if you look at something like The Mandalorian, you'll also notice that each episode kind of has its own task or quest, and it is resolved, but each resolution leads to another part of the story. And there's this overarching storyline. But you don't have 2 to 2.5 hours to explore each case. So each case is a little bit smaller than each big case in a movie. So what you end up with is a novel or movie may have a full, complete 3-act structure and leave you with few questions, but at least some that maybe carry you through to the next book. A serial or a TV show will not usually have a complete, complex 3-act structure. Some serials will actually have a beginning, middle, end, a climax and resolution for each episode of the serial, but it's not going to be as drawn out or complex or detailed as a novel in most cases. Now, I will say this, there are, in my mind or experience of reading, 2 different kinds of serials, the same way that we have multiple kinds of series. So with a serial, you could have something that is what I call a dynamic series or dynamic serial, like my Sacrifice Me season, for example. You can't jump in episode 3 and understand what the heck is going on. You have to start from the beginning. And the same thing is true with a show like Lost, that you have to start at the beginning. Then there are serials that are more standalone or self-contained. So you can go on a spectrum there the same way that you can with novel series. So you've got standalone series that are things like Law and Order. So there's things you learn about the characters as you go. You see the same characters every time, but it is a self-contained case. And you could jump in on episode 562 of Law and Order and still basically get the idea of what's happening. Each episode does have a self-contained case, but it's not as complex as an entire movie like The Departed. So hopefully that gives you an idea. So in a serial, if you decide that you want to write one, you can make it where it's a continuing storyline or a single case or a single mystery or a single romance that takes place over multiple volumes and has a certain kind of structure, which we'll talk about in a minute. Or it can be each one is self-contained, like Law and Order, or Supernatural kind of has this sort of feel to it where each one is sort of a case, but there are really big overarching storylines that do get woven in throughout and sometimes sort of take over the story. So hopefully that gives you a better idea. Another way to explain that is if a novel is a movie and a serial is a TV show, then part of what makes them different, like I just said, is complexity and length. Novels tend to be more complex and they tend to be longer with a full story structure per novel. Serials tend to be less complex in each episode. Now, as you go through the entire 6 episodes, it might actually be more complex than a single novel, but each individual episode is usually less complex when it comes to the plot line, and it's usually shorter. So when it comes to length, there is no industry standard, again, for a serial, but most of the ones that I have seen have ranged anywhere from 5,000 words to about 30,000 words. A serial of novellas is pretty common. So my Sacrifice Me series starts at 17,000 words, and I think it goes up to about 26,000 words at the longest episode. You don't traditionally see serials that are 50,000 words per episode. By the time you get to that long and complex of a storyline, you're looking at novels, not serials. So in my opinion, usually you're going to see a serial of between 5 and 30,000 words. Another thing that differentiates them is the pacing. So this is also a very important distinction. Because they are meant to be consumed as a whole, you have a little bit more leeway and expectation to have parts that are fast-paced and parts that are slower paced. So you can have a slower beginning, a slower intro. You can have more emotional reaction to things that take longer or is more drawn out. You can not put as many twists and turns in as long as you hit those main turning points, like the act 1 climax, the second act climax, your black moment, as long as you're hitting those turning points, you can have a lot of rising and falling action when it comes to your pacing in your novel. A serial is less forgiving when it comes to pacing. A serial, for the most part, needs to be, since it's shorter serving, it needs to be very tightly written. You don't have a lot of time for a lot of introspection in your character's mind. Everything needs to be feeding into the conflict of the story. And that is what makes a truly great serial. Questions, answers, investigations, emotional discovery, all of that stuff is still there in a novel, of course, but in a serial, you're getting more of it because it's just more concentrated into a smaller format. So a 15,000 word piece of your serial can't be 15,000 words of a conversation, or shouldn't probably be, unless you can make that conversation really complex and interesting. You need action, and you don't have as much time to get it in there. So in my mind, I'm just going to draw this out, put it up here on the screen, because I couldn't find a better graphic of this. But in my mind, you have a novel which can start at a conflict tense point or a lower point. You have some story development here, and then you'll have a turning point with rising action, and then you'll have a reaction to that action, and you'll have things that happen, conversations that happen, and then you'll have another moment of rising action. And the entire novel will go that way. Lots of rising and falling action. In a serial, however, the very first episode, you are usually introducing the world. So you've got maybe a little bit slower paced right there at the beginning. You're introducing the characters, you're introducing the world. So you're going to have some exposition in the first episode. But then you're usually going to have a hook right from the beginning, grab them right from the start, where it's like that promise of the premise appears a little bit earlier in a serial for the most part. And you're going to see rising action throughout almost the entire serial or episode. And you'll see a little bit of a dip with a reaction, and then constant rising, and maybe a little bit of a dip with an emotional conversation or introspection. But for the most part, each entire episode of your serial is going to have that rising action. And then you're going to have some kind of climax. It could be an answer, it could be a battle, it could be a confrontation, or new information comes to light. And then you're going to have a moment of what feels like slight resolution. And then boom, it's going to hit you with another twist or another piece of information that is immediately going to make you go, where is the next episode of this serial? I need it immediately. And really great TV shows do this the same way. And it could be anything from Grey's Anatomy to Lost to Weeds to any genre that you look at. It doesn't have to be paranormal or big action, but it's just that feeling of like you've got a little bit of introduction at the beginning, maybe a slower pace at the beginning, but the action is pretty much always rising. The conflict is always rising up to that ending point. You don't have as many peaks and valleys in each episode of your serial. It's always driving you to whatever that ending moment is for this particular episode of the serial. This is why I say that you can't just take any old novel and break it into pieces, because in my mind, each episode needs to have that rising action. Whereas if you just chunk out 15,000 words of a novel, you might have nothing but low valley points with no climaxes, nothing that really makes people want to read the next thing. So I feel like for that reason, the third thing, not just pacing, but the structure of a serial is different than the structure of a novel. Okay, so I'm actually coming back after I was working on my edits, and I just deleted about 12 minutes of me talking about structure because I don't think I did a good enough job explaining it. So I'm going to take another crack at it here and say that I feel like for me, in my personal experience, the way it made the most sense to structure my serial is I had 6 episodes to work with. The entire set of 6 episodes needed to have its own 3-act structure. But because it was separated into 6 pieces instead of 4 or 3, if you want to look at it exact 3-act, I had to manipulate a little bit. So the end of Act 1 is usually that into the new world moment. But because of the premise and the short-serving novella type style I was following with a serial, I wanted to hit that Act 1 climax in the very first episode at the very end. So the Act 1 climax in a normal 120,000 word novel structurally should come around 25% or around 30,000 words into the book. However, for me, that would have put me halfway through the second episode, and it wouldn't have made sense to have episode 1 end and then keep moving into the Act 1 climax and then still have stuff after it. The Act 1 climax was a perfect place to throw a cliffhanger into the story. So what I had happen instead was manipulated the percentages of my novel, and I said, okay, since I'm writing a serial, I'm going to put that into the New World moment right there in the very first episode. So it happens more like 10% of the overall serial. So in that way, I feel like you may still have, over the course of your entire serial, a loose 3-act structure where you have a Act 1 climax, you still have a midpoint. For me, since I had 6 episodes, my midpoint did happen at the end of episode 3, and it was one of the biggest twists. But instead of having a falling off point after that, where you have like a recalibration, I just threw more twists in because you're constantly ratcheting up that tension and conflict in a serial in a way you might not always feel is necessary in a novel. So I kept some of the loose 3-act structure as a sort of umbrella for the entire serial, but each individual percentage didn't fall exactly in the traditional place for a novel. You have to sometimes be willing to manipulate the story structure. Instead of writing a novel and then chunking it down, you're making sure that you're pulling your readers along, that they're going to be turning pages and that they're hitting the good structural points that they need to hit in each episode. In addition to that overarching structure of the season of my serial, I also had a microstructure. So every individual episode had its own beginning, middle, and end. It had a question at the beginning, like how will Frankie handle this? Or what is Ren going to do after this thing? So it's a recalibration moment followed by new questions, rising conflict, fast pacing, investigation, whatever needs to happen in that episode. But there is kind of a single question, and it has that sort of microstructure so that each episode felt like it did have a resolution. But unlike a novel where it feels like the resolution to the whole main story question, it was just a resolution to one small problem of that episode. So in that way, it's kind of is like you're breaking a novel into pieces, but each piece of the story needs to have its own structure. Whereas in a novel, you don't have that exact same micro structure to your book. And to me, this is one of the main differences between writing a novel or a series of novels and writing a serial, which is a series of episodes. Another difference in the plot structure, as I mentioned before, is that typically in a novel, you're going to have, by the end of each novel, that story question and most of the issues that were going on in that novel are going to be resolved in some manner. So think of it this way. We're going back to that movie TV because I really think that examples can be so valuable. You have the difference between, say, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the movie. So you have the story of how she becomes a slayer and her finally embracing her life as a slayer. It happens all in one movie. So it's paced very differently than Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the series, where she has an entire seasons of coming into her own and character arc, and each one is an individual case. Whereas in the movie, it's basically just this one situation where she's fighting this one guy and like trying not to become his, and she wants to be a slayer instead. But when you come to season 1 of Buffy, that sort of storyline of will she become his or will she stand on her own and become the slayer is spread over the course of multiple episodes. And each episode has its own point or its own case or its own mystery to solve, but there's also this stretched out overarching storyline. And overall, you get a lot more depth of the story this way, but each individual episode is not as complex or have as many rise and fall moments as the movie. Another example would be if you have like a police procedural movie where you're trying to figure out who done it or you're trying to get the bad guy. So you've got something like Seven or The Usual Suspects or The Girl on the Train, not police procedural, but some kind of mystery like that. For a movie, you've got the entire whodunit, you know by the end who did it, you have that resolution. Whereas when it comes to a serial or a TV series, you have something like Broadchurch, where there's a single case stretched out over the course of the entire season, and you get answers along the way, but each episode brings you more questions. Oh my gosh, maybe it's him, maybe it's her, maybe it's this. I need to know more. And you don't find out the ultimate who done it until the end of the 10 or however many episodes there were in Broadchurch season 1. So it's that idea of you've got a complete story here, maybe with a few unanswered questions. That is a novel. And when a novel is a series, then you've got an umbrella of sorts. Go back and watch my series on how to write a series and you'll get that idea, versus a serial where you have a complete story that's told over multiple installments at a faster pace and with a continuing driving conflict that really leaves you with a lot of questions after each episode. And the answers to the questions don't come fully until the end. So hopefully this gives you a really good idea of what the difference is between a series and a serial. Now, if you would like to hear more about the idea of publishing a serial, what my experience was, I do talk a little bit about it on today's blog post. If you want to head over to that, the link is in the description box down below. I also would be happy to do more videos on this because I love the idea of serials, and I'm planning another serial coming up, not this year, but maybe next year. And I would love to talk more about my personal experience and what I've seen in the industry in terms of what works when it comes to marketing and publishing serials, how long they should be for each genre, which genres work better with serials, as well as what you should price your serials at. So if you're interested in hearing more about that sort of serial publishing strategy, please let me know. Also, if you are an indie author or an aspiring author who is looking to self-publish, start your own publishing company, self-publish your books and get them in the hands of readers, but it just feels so overwhelming, I have an amazing course for you. It is called Publish and Thrive. And this is basically everything I have learned, what I wish I had known from the beginning. This is a 5-week course with something like 100 hours of videos, lots of bonuses. You get lifetime access, and this can be really the foundation that you need to have a successful publishing career for yourself. I would absolutely love to have you in that course, but it closes Sunday night at midnight Eastern time. So we start on Monday, and I'm not planning to let anybody in late. Join us by Sunday or you'll miss this round. I will open it again, hopefully this fall, but I would love to have you in this round and go ahead and make that investment in your own future. Get started on your self-publishing dreams. Even if you haven't finished your first book yet, it can still be a good idea to get those fundamentals of understanding genre and your strategy and setting up your business and your social media and your website before you start publishing. So come join us. We would love to have you in the thriving author community, and I will see you guys in my next video. Don't forget to subscribe, like this video if you enjoyed it and got a lot out of it, and let me know in the comments what future videos on series or serials you would like to see. All right, guys, I'll talk to you soon. Bye.